want to talk about is...
And it was after editing my whole video where I realized all the recommendations I make in this video, although they are really good and you should still watch the rest of the video, this is just a quick interruption, are similar in setting. They are all historical fiction from the point of view of a female protagonist. So if that's not your thing, I'm just going to make some honorable mentions at the end of this video. Please keep an eye out for them. I'm going to list them in my blog post, but I thought I would just add this here at the beginning so you don't skip at the end. But check out my blog if you're not into any of the books I recommend, even though I think you should still read them because they're really good. Okay, bye.
The first thing I want to talk about is books. I am a humongous bookworm. I do not have my books on my shelf at the moment because the shelf keeps getting repurposed for different things. So the first book I want to talk about is called Emma. It's a classic. It's a Jane Austen book. I haven't actually read the book, but I recently just watched the 2020 film adaptation of the book. I believe there was a previous film with Gwyneth Paltrow. I haven't watched that version, but I fell in love with the 2020 film. It's amazing. I'm very into, like I said, what did I say? I don't know if I said my favorite book genre is probably kind of historical romance. That's the kind of, those are the type of books that I lean towards the most and I get a lot of pleasure from reading. But I do like kind of psychological thrillers as well. So Jane Austen, right up my street. Emma is actually the inspiration behind the very famous cult classic film Clueless. So if you watch Clueless, then you basically know the plot for Emma. It's the same plot, it's just set in a different time. And it's interesting. I think it's really interesting as a book, of course, and there's definitely, I guess, going to be a lot more detail in the book, which is why I want to read it. But as a film, it's very interesting to watch. It's interesting to see how the different classes dress and how they interact, and the actors are just really good. But it's the same plot as Clueless. So it's a girl from a very comfortable, wealthy upbringing who kind of just entertains herself by finding a friend who is, I guess, seen as lesser than in society and uses her as her little doll kind of entertainment. And through the process of that happening, her future love interest is quite critical of her vanity and her arrogance, and she becomes more humble over time and realizes how vain she is. And it's a really nice, heartwarming film and book, and it's really good for autumn. I really liked the film, so I really want to read the book. The film is set throughout the year, so it goes through different seasons, but I don't know why, the film gives you this cozy vibe. Like, I felt very cozy watching it, and so I feel like if you read the book, it would also give you that kind of cozy feeling that would kind of just make you feel nice and warm inside. And it's a romance. Romance makes you feel happy, and I feel like you have the term summer romance, but I feel like autumn romance should be a thing. I think autumn is a very romantic season. It's like, it's cold and it's sweet, and then you get a cup of coffee, and I don't know. I think autumn is nice, and I think it would be a good book to read for autumn. Okay, so the next book I'm going to recommend... Oh my god. I just broke a nail. Might as well, because it's the same author. The next book I'm going to recommend is Pride and Prejudice. This is my... Oh, it's kind of right. This is my coffee. It's battered, but I haven't even gotten through it. I bought this book like a year ago, with the intention to start reading again, because I haven't read for pleasure in a really long time, since, you know, I'm a humanities major and I'm always reading for either for uni or I was reading for my A-levels, and I just never read for myself anymore. And so I really wanted to read Pride and Prejudice because I also really like the film. I need to watch the BBC series. I've seen tidbits, but not the whole thing. But I really like the movie as well, although, I don't know, the movie definitely gives me spring vibes. So the book should as well, but there's something about Jane Austen books that just make me feel very cozy and warm. Autumn is a very romantic season. I don't know why it doesn't get labeled as a romantic season. I think it is. So romance books make me feel cozy, and so I think they're appropriate for autumn. So Pride and Prejudice. Should I explain? Okay, I feel like Pride and Prejudice, I don't need to explain what happens in the book because it's so famous. But just know, it's a romance book, but it's also, there's quite a lot of comedy in the book. Like, the book is funny. The film is funny, the book is funny. If you're interested in history and class, this is also really interesting. I really like the Regency era based things, so I always find Jane Austen books and, what's the other author? Jane Austen and the name's gone, but the other one they were around at the same time. I like reading those type of books. They make me happy. So Pride and Prejudice and Emma. So the next two books I'm going to talk about, I can't find my physical copy of the other one, but I'll just put a picture of it on the screen when I start talking about it. But I'm going to talk about this one first. Now, this book is my favourite book that exists in the world. It's my absolute favourite book. I first read this book when I was maybe 14, 15. I read it in secondary school. So it is aimed at adolescents. It's aimed at teenagers. So it's not necessarily like the most classically it's also not a very I wouldn't say the book is very juvenile, but don't expect it to be ridiculously sophisticated is what I'm trying to say. It's quite simple, but it's also, I think, sophisticated enough in the sense that even as an adult, at 21, I can still enjoy this book. So the book is Fallen Grace by Mary Hooper. I really like this author. She was, the right phrasing for this? The first book I read when I started secondary school was by this author, because she does a lot of historical based books. They're mainly based around Victorian era London, which I love. I'm a big history buff. So I really like all of her books. Some of them are romances, some of them aren't. This isn't a romance. This is more, I guess, what is this labeled as? You could label it as a thriller. It's kind of sad. The book is low-key sad. Like, it's not. There are good bits, like happier bits, but it's a sad book. But it's sad in the sense that it's deep and it's realistic towards the time. To summarize without giving too much away, the book is about a girl, and she is a girl called Grace, and her older sister. Oh my gosh, what's her older sister's name? Her older sister called Lily. So I think Grace is about 16 in the book, and Lily is maybe about 18. Lily has a disability. She has some sort of mental disorder, is what it's insinuated to be. So maybe autism or something along those lines. But not so much so that when you look at her, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell she has a disability until she speaks. So she has some sort of communicative disorder. So she has some sort of communicative disorder, which leads Grace to being the main breadwinner in the family. The mother passed away giving birth to Grace, and their father was an explorer that went missing, and so they were left orphaned. And as you can imagine, orphans in Victorian London didn't necessarily live the best life. All of the girls were abused in the orphanage, but something happened to Grace that led her to have to run away from the orphanage with her sister. And so there's just so much. I don't want to give it away. I don't want to give away too much of the book, but just know it's so good. The storyline is just it's really good. I can't really say anything without giving stuff away, but the main plot of the story is told quite early on. You don't have to wait too long to find out the main plot, but it builds over time. If you like kind of thrillers and you like historical based things, you would like this. It's quite historically accurate, and there's no like, you know, sappy romance stuff in this book. It's really nice. Just read the book. Read the book. It's not expensive. You can get it on Amazon, I think. Get it secondhand. It's not expensive, especially if you get paperback. It's a really good book. Just read it. Okay, the second book that I don't have, but I'll put a picture of here, is by the same author. This book is what made me fall in love with historical novels and books and literature. It's aimed at teenagers, so it's not going to be the most sophisticated of books, but it's a nice story. I like the historical nuances in the book. It's based around the time of the plague in London, so it gets a bit, I wouldn't say it's gory, but it's the plague, so you can't imagine it to be like, you know, bunnies and skipping and la-di-da. Like, it gets a bit deep again, and it gets a bit dark, but I wouldn't say it's super dark. It's not horror. I wouldn't call it a thriller. I'd call it, if you want to call The Plague a thriller, like the event itself, then I guess the book is a thriller, and then it's also a romance. It is a romantic book, and it's a series, so there are three. Yeah, I think there are 3 installments. Yes, it's one of my favorite books. I can't even remember how many books there are in the series. There are 3 installments, I believe, but I'm just going to recommend the first one, and if you're into it, then read the others. So the first book is based around the plague. You know, they enter London at the breakout of the plague, and then things just start getting worse to the point where they're able to escape just barely with their lives. And then the second book is a continuation with that and how they get back into London when things have died down. And then the third book is The Fire of London. Really good. If you like historical romances, you'll like it. It's very, I was going to say it's lighthearted. It's not lighthearted. The romance kind of helps stop the book being so somber, because you've got that kind of heartwarming, they're falling in love kind of thing, and at the same time it's dark because there are kids dying, so it's nice. I really like it. If you're into that kind of thing, I think you'll like both books. I think if you like Fall and Grace, you'll like At the Sign of the Sugared Plum, At the Sign of the Sugared Plum. Unless you just don't like romances, then you might find that bit a bit tedious. So my third and final book, I tried to give a kind of diverse range when it came to books. So the Jane Austen books are a bit more adult, they're more sophisticated. The Mary Hooper books are a bit more simple, maybe for people who don't like such, you know, the Jane Austen books are written with the type of English of the time, they're not simplified, so if you're not a big reader, then you might find it a bit tedious to understand the language. So the Mary Hooper books, I think, still give the same aura, a similar sophistication, but a bit easier to read. They're easier to process. You don't have to do as much thinking of the words and understanding and interpreting of the times and the nuances of the times. So if Jane Austen is a bit too tedious for you, then I think you'll like Mary Hooper. And if you like Mary Hooper, I think, okay, this book is aimed for children, but I don't care. It's a really good book, and I will read it time and time again. I think this book is aimed for children, but I don't think it's a kid's book. Like, I think it's just a really good book. Okay, the book I'm talking about is Hetty Feather. I know, it's a Jacqueline Wilson book, but listen, this book is a piece of art. You can see a common theme here. I don't really like books based in modern settings. I like historical books. I have probably read this book. You can see it's not, I have books that are more bruised than this. I literally have books that don't have the first 5 pages. but you can see how much I've read this. This was my favorite book in the world. I think this book came out in year 7 when I was in year 7, so that would have been 2010 maybe. Doubleday edition published 2010. Yeah, so this came out when I was in year 7, and I remember reading this during the summer holidays, I think, and I read this book over and over and over again. Or was it during school? Yeah, it was just at the end of the summer holidays, so this is probably why this book reminds me of autumn. I read this book around the time which would have been now, so just before school starts. The important thing is, this book is amazing. This book is about an orphan, Hetty Feather, during the Victorian era in London, and it's just the adventures of the very fiery, spirited, red-haired Hetty Feather. The book is amazing. I love it. It's kind of like, it's low-key Tracy Beaker, but Victorian. Like, they've got a similar spirit. They're very fiery and they're very feisty. And it's just interesting how Hetty is just kind of dealing to terms with her being an orphan, her losing what was her family, her foster family, and how she's dealing with how the world is treating her as an orphan and what will become of her because she is an orphan. And it's a really interesting book. It's a series, so you have Hetty Feather, and then you have Sapphire Battersea, and then you have Emerald Star, and then I believe there's a 4th book, which I haven't read. This book has an ending. Like, Emerald Star has an ending, but I know there is a 4th book, and it's based on this character here, a girl she meets at the circus. So it's from her perspective, but obviously Hetty is still in the book because they're together in the circus. So technically there is a 4th book, but I think there's actually like a 4th book in the Hetty Feather series. But I think there are 5 books altogether in the franchise because of this girl's called Angel, and I think it's called Angel's something. If all the books that I just told you like the sound of, then you're gonna like Hetty Feather. And yes, although it might be simple, because it is a children's book, it has to be simple enough for children to read, it is still so detailed. And again, if you're a history buff and you like books that go into detail about history and give you kind of those nuances about history and how it would have been for an orphan in the Victorian era, then you'll love this. I love this book so much. I love Hetty. I wish she was real.
So the first book I'm going to recommend is Entangled by Kat Clark. This is a young adult fiction, really good if you're into darker psychological thrillers. The second book I'm going to recommend is historical fiction, but it's from a male protagonist's point of view. It's The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I don't really need to explain these, but this is probably the most autumny kind of book on my list, and they're really good. So if you're into mystery, read them. The third book I'm going to recommend is finally not a historical fiction, it's modern. It's codenamed Villanelle. It's the book that inspired the award-winning BBC series Killing Eve. This is really good if you're into psychological thrillers and action. Super good. Highly recommend, and I recommend the series as well. My next recommendation is kind of cheating because it is quite an old novel, but it's set in an alternate reality, so technically technically it's not a historical novel. It's Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This always gets me in the mood for autumn because it reminds me of Comic-Con, since I went as the Mad Hatter last year. If you've watched the movie, obviously you'll know what the book is about. The book is really interesting, so I highly recommend giving it a read as well, even if you've watched the movie. The final novel I'm recommending is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. Everyone has pretty much watched the movie for this, but the book is super interesting as well, and the illustrations are great to look at too. Super wacky, super fun, and they talk about chocolate, so what's not to enjoy?
So those are my book recommendations. I hope you really like them. I'll check if they're available on Audible as well. You can normally get a free trial for Audible, and with a free trial for Audible you get a free book. So I'll see if there's one available so that you guys can try an Audible book if you're not into paperbacks. But honestly, most of those books you'll be able to get secondhand, and you can get them super cheap. Paperback secondhand books are dirt cheap, and books are fun. So try at least one of them out. I think you'll like them a lot. Tea's gone cold. I'm just gonna chat. I'm gonna chat about loads of different things. I'm gonna talk about books, music, movies, makeup, perfume, everything, but all in the spirit of autumn. I'm so excited. You know, you have winter people who like, you know, the snow and winter holidays and whatnot, and you have summer people and you have spring people. I am an autumn person.